Okay, so before I really dive into this, I wanted to tell you a quick story about a 15-year-old boy named John. John's mom died when he was a kid, and his father decided to remarry a woman who actually abused John and his little brother. His father, who was an alcoholic, didn't intervene, and if anything, was pretty neglectful to John and his brother. So John ended up moving to live with his uncle, who took any of the wages that John had earned, which was about 4 shillings a week. John wrote in his diary that he often cried bitterly and that uncle was always calling me ungrateful, he wrote, but I was always doing the best that I could. John ended up moving to New York, where he lived on the streets and operated as a pickpocket until he was picked up by the Children's Aid Society in 1867. So John's story really did not exist in a vacuum. Street children became a huge social problem that existed throughout the 19th century and on a global scale, so much so that they became, quote, an inescapable fixture of urban life, largely due to urbanization from industrialization and immigration and migration and effects from the Civil War. 30,000 children ended up living in New York City streets by 1872. To survive, many of these children turned to petty crimes like pickpocketing, like John had, or in the case of girls, even prostitution. This rise in child crime inspired some, like Charles Loring Brace, who was the head of the Children's Aid Society and just a philanthropist in general, to care and to try and help these kids. But for others, like the NYPD, who was utterly unequipped to handle the problems that were happening, and the middle class, who had deemed these children enemies and threats to their values, saw them just as street rats. So at the same time as all of this happening, there was a popular perception of childhood that was changing by the mid-century. So where children were once seen as economic tools for the family, who were expected to kind of earn their keep, a newly idealized version of childhood saw children as precious and as things to be protected and sheltered. However, this idealized childhood was simply an impossibility for the working class and for the poor, and was essentially just reserved for the middle class. So even along childhood, a class divide emerged based on values surrounding children. Now, when I ask most people to think about a street child, I feel like most people will think about this kid, Oliver Twist. And that was actually probably the case for a lot of Americans in the 19th century as well. Charles Dickens was immensely popular in America, and a lot of people had read Oliver Twist. Um, and Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist with the intention of bringing social reform to the poor. But in literature in general, there were a lot of problems regarding how they tried to bring about social reform. So a lot of literature from the time failed to elicit the kind of social reform that they had intended. Literature like Oliver Twist, or in America, there were a lot of books by Horatio Alger Jr., and they presented street children as either threats to the middle class values and utilitarian ideals, or sentimentalized and pitied creatures who had fallen off the rightful path. So Oliver and Dick in the story of Ragged Dick and Struggling Upwards were both presented as diamonds in the rough. So they were the good in comparison to every other poor child or character in general who was presented, who were all villainous type characters. In the case of Oliver Twist, it was actually revealed that Oliver was a middle class, he was from a middle class family all along. And in both of these stories, it really just confirmed middle class beliefs that only some people should be saved, and the people who should be saved were the ones who already existed within middle class values. So as a call for social reform, it wasn't actually that effective because it assumed that only some should be saved when really all should be saved. Similarly, with illustrations, depictions of street children were generally dressed up into more sanitary versions of themselves in order to appeal to middle class sensibilities. So the middle class didn't like seeing dirty people in their magazines, and illustrators really just kind of bought into that and didn't portray them as realistically as they could. So they looked cleaner, they had fewer blemishes. They often looked like a little bit ragged with their clothing. But besides that, a lot of times their faces were obscured and you couldn't really actually get a good picture of what you were looking at. And that was hardly a significant call to arms for the middle class either. So what really changed the game was photography, largely due to the work by Dutch immigrant Jacob Riis. So Rees managed to take advantage of a lot of photographic advancements that were happening towards the end of the 19th century to put forth an image of reality that really the middle class could not deny. Now, whether this actually was reality is debatable. Rees staged a lot of his photographs, but what is important is that the middle class took it to be reality. So you can see in these pictures, street children were shown barefoot, dirty, caught in really claustrophobic scenes, like debris everywhere or garbage. So photography was a medium that really suggested reality and truth, which was something that the middle class could not deny as they could with previous depictions in literature or in illustrations. So even comparing one of Rees's photographs against an illustrated version that appeared in his How the Other Half Lives book, you can see just the stark difference in detail. In the illustration, his photograph is cropped, so you don't really get a feel for how claustrophobic that space actually is, with the illusion of like an outside world above where the boys are sleeping. So Rees really caught the attention of the middle class with his photographs in a way that any other previous depiction of street children really failed to do. And he was able to do that by building off of those failures and making something into his own. He appealed to the middle class enough, but also challenged the norms that they had established. And my favorite thing was that he did actually manage to bring reform for street children and actually turned Mulberry Bend, which was the infamous place where street children tended to congregate, into a playground by the 19th century with help from Theodore Roosevelt, who was in charge of the NYPD at the time. My greatest takeaway from completing this project was how much representation genuinely matters, and how marginalized groups are presented actually does make a difference in terms of how the wider public views them, and has a direct impact on social reform and on stereotyping. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening.